day and welcome to the FW de Klerk's Constitution at Work podcast. I'm Daniela Ellerbeck. I'm an attorney and the manager of the Foundation's Constitutional Rights program. Today's podcast is the third in our series on electoral reform. Joining me today is my colleague, Christo van der Rheede, the Foundation's executive director, and the Foundation's new interns, Nkandu and Sonia Twongyeirwe. We also have the privilege of being joined today by esteemed guest, Professor Theo Venter, a professor of practice at the University of Johannesburg and a scenario expert, strategist, and political commentator. Now, in this podcast, we are discussing what electoral systems are and why they matter. Welcome, everyone. Perhaps let's start with how you got involved in the topic of electoral reform.
Well, you're taking me back to 1974-75 when I was a student. I got keenly involved in elections, and that was really a big interest. Now, at that time, the study of elections was primarily dominated by British and European writers, and a book like that one of C.F. Strong, I can still remember that one, was kind of the stuff that we studied. And in those days, the preconceived idea was that a first past the post system, like we see in England or America, New Zealand, Australia, that is the better version of elections, and proportional representation then was regarded as a European kind of development, and it created electoral chaos. As I moved on, I realized that there's a very, very different world out there than this idea that first past the post, or the so-called simple plurality system, is the best one. It is not at all. And then in 1987, I got a master's student doing research under me by the name of Donald Simpson. And Donald Simpson had this notion that he wanted to study the relative equity within the first past the post system. In other words, is this electoral system fair? And of course, South Africa's history is a wonderful history to study the fairness, even though it was only elections among the white population. But in that white population sector, it was clear that the 1948 election was won by the United Party in terms of the number of votes, but the National Party won by number of seats. So there already you have this weird outcome. And that same result, few people know about it, but that same result was repeated in 1952 election, 1953 really, where the Nats still had less votes than the opposition party, the United Party. And then only in the elections of 1957-58, the National Party then had more seats in parliament and equally more votes. And then the big question came up, if we then change the political dispensation, what model should we use? And Donald Simpson indicated in his extensive research, a first past the post system has its benefits, but it does weird things. Let me give you an example. If you look at the recent election, this is last year in Great Britain, the Labour Party won with a landslide in the lower house. They got about 300 of the 500 seats in parliament, but their percentage of the vote was 34%. The Conservative Party got just over 30%. So if that election were to take place in South Africa, they would have had a government of national unity. But in a first past the post system, they won with a landslide. How is this possible? Because if you have elections in wards and you have, let's say, 600 wards, you've got 5 or 6 different political parties contesting. One party win a specific ward where 6 parties are, of course, contesting. That one party has, let's say, 40% of the vote. The second party only receives 20% of the vote. And the other 4 parties all receives votes in the low numbers, 8%, 9%, and so on. The one with the 40% wins. But if you count the other votes together, the opposition has got more votes than the one that won. Now, if you then turn out the votes, then you'll see how it's possible that first past the post provides that kind of election. If you look at Donald Trump's election, which is also a kind of a first past the post election in the United States, if you look at the numbers, the Democrats got virtually, I would say, over a population size of 330 million, about 1 million votes less than Donald Trump. But if you read the newspapers, this was a major landslide victory by Trump. in proportional representation, this cannot happen. And that is why this whole thing caught my interest, that you have to look at the relative fairness of the election, different versions of it, but those are the two types, first past the post. The other type, of course, is proportional representation, among which you've got several forms, and you even have hybrid forms between the first past the post and proportional, like South Africa is currently using in its local government elections. So your question was, my interest, where is it from? Well, it's from very long ago, and I've done some research, and then additionally, I've taken part, I'm lucky to say that, but I've taken part in every election since 1987 in one form or another, as a commentator on radio or a commentator on TV or an analyst with the IEC or whatever. So my background in elections and election reform, election analysis really goes back to 1987.
I would love you to go back to that point that you made about the fairness of electoral systems, and that being what piqued your interest. Because if I understood correctly what you said, if South Africa's electoral system had been different, then our 1948 election with General Smuts and the National Party would have been different, because what you were saying is Smuts actually won most of the votes.
Yes, it would have been different. And let me just say one technical thing about 1948. The reason why it happened was concentration of support. That's the essence of what happened in 1948. Concentration of support is also the essence of how Kamala Harris lost to Donald Trump. 2/3 of her support was concentrated in California, in the eastern side of America, New York and Massachusetts and so on, and a little bit down in Texas. Donald Trump had support all over America. Now, if you look at the system where Keys College eventually elects the president, then you can see how the millions of people voted for Kamala Harris in California only had access to 54 electoral votes, although they were twice the size of any of the other states. Now, exactly the same happened in 1948. What the government did, and this was the Smuts government, not the National Party government, they decided that wards in cities and wards in the rural areas should look different, and that the wards in cities or urban areas would have a loading of 15%, and the wards in rural areas would have an unloading of 15%. So if you take typically Cape Town, Milnerton, and 3,000 people make up a ward, you can then add 15%, and that still then represents one person. And then you go to Carnarvon or someplace in the rural areas, and you take 3,000 less 15%, and that less number, if you have it spread all over the country, gives you the main advantage. This is the essential problem with the first past the post system, the way in which wards are designed. And in South Africa, we've got a commission that determines that from time to time. I think currently they're sitting.
Prof, this is absolutely fascinating, because for the average South African, myself included, I honestly thought it came down to who got the most votes. I had no idea that all of this mathematical and political intrigue was happening behind the scenes. But perhaps let's start with the simple question of what is an electoral system and why does it matter?
Let's go to the fundamentals. It goes down to the definition of what is a democracy. And very often people say one of the key characteristics of a democracy is regular elections. Now, you have elections in Russia, you have elections in many of these authoritarian and dictatorial states, but the purpose of those elections is like a public awareness campaign or something like that. It is not to really change who controls politics. And China is a very good example. China's got a huge parliament elected within the ambit of party members. So if you're outside the party membership, then of course you can't be in parliament. And from the Greeks, where we got the term democracy, we must remember that in those Greek city-states, the voting was limited to men, and it was limited to men in good standing. Even slaves couldn't vote. They can look on. Women could see what's going on, but they couldn't participate. Around about, let's say, the First World War and after the First World War, the whole question of gender in politics started changing. And today, but I think generally speaking, elections nowadays globally is seen as an issue where male and female can participate equally. In the biggest democracy in the world, and that is not America, the biggest democracy in my view is India, with about 1.3 billion people. That is truly a democracy, with all kinds of developmental problems like South Africa. But in America, that is regarded as the democracy to watch. It is clear to me, watching the American political system, that ever since Geraldine Ferraro participated in the election as a vice presidential candidate up to Kamala Harris, it seems to me the American electorate is not yet ready for a female president. I hope it changes, but that to me is one of the weak points. Your question was, what is an electoral system? It is a regular process that is determined in two ways. If you follow the British Westminster type government, and we see examples of that in Australia, in New Zealand, in Canada, and of course in the UK. Elections take place every 5 years, but a prime minister can decide on a snap election. He can decide 2 years into an election that it is now time for an election. So the time frame is not fixed. In South Africa and America, the time frame is fixed. We have elections every 5 years. Typically 90 days before or after the final day of the 5 years. In America, they even have a more intricate system designed over 200 years. They have presidential elections every 4 years, absolutely fixed, on the second Tuesday of November. You can't even change the date. The date is constitutionally determined. Then you have elections for the House of Representatives every 2 years. And that is called a midterm election. So when you have a presidential election like we had in November, at the same time, you also have the re-election of 435 members of the House of Representatives. But they only serve 2 years. At the same time, you have elections for Senate, where 1/3 of the Senate is elected for a period of 6 years. So in the Senate, they've built in continuity. 1/3 comes up for election every 2 years, but it's only 1/3. So Donald Trump is now the president for the next 4 years. But in the dynamics of American politics, he's actually president for the next 18 months. Because roughly 18 months from now, the guys in the House of Representatives are going to start preparing for the next midterm election. And therefore, they're not going to worry about what the president is doing and which country he's going to hit with tariffs or whatever he's going to do. They are going to be worried to be re-elected in the House of Representatives for another 2 years. So that's a very interesting, it's the shortest term that I know of. But all elections take place on the second Tuesday of November. That's a fixed date. The fact that you have a system where political office bearers are going back to the population from time to time to renew a mandate, that is the essence of democracy to a very large extent. So regular elections equals good democracies. And I just want to add that a good democracy is not only measured by good elections. A good democracy is also measured by the strength of opposition parties. Can they actually play a role? Do they have a hold on government, and can they change government in whatever way, whether it's when they're in coalition government or whether they ask for a motion of no confidence and so on. And the third part of a democracy, which people very often forget, is the political culture. What is the political culture? Is democracy inculcated in how people think about politics, so that they would say on a meeting, guys, this is not democratic. That tells you if somebody does that in a different kind of sphere of society, it means that there is a democratic culture in this country.
Okay, so if I had to summarize what you just said, an electoral system determines how the votes in a regular democratic election translates into seats in parliament and how often those elections are held. Would you say that that is correct?
That's absolutely correct. And I think you can add a third part to it, and what the processes are to get an unpopular government out of seats, to prevent somebody from staying in power for life like we see in Zimbabwe.
That is a very important feature. So, Prof, this whole thing of electoral systems is a novel area for many South Africans. What are the main types of systems that exist?
Okay, I will keep that short. Electoral systems branch into three systems. On the one side, you have direct elections. In other words, where no political parties play a role and the people vote directly for whatever they want to do. Those systems are very few and far between, and they typically operate in local government level, sometimes at regional level, and in at least one country you will see that kind of system, and that is Switzerland. But it is unique, and it is very difficult nowadays to operate an election without an institution like a political party, because a political party has become the agent in elections and in democracy. So political parties is a very key part here. The second political system is the second oldest, and that is the first past the post, or the so-called pluralist system, where you have wards, and in every ward a small election takes place. And then the third branch would be proportional representation, which emerged primarily in Europe, where the question was asked, is it reflective of the political culture to have only two political parties? Now, let me jump immediately back to first past the post. I haven't said it before, but I think it's a very important point to make. First past the post systems, or pluralist systems, work best where you have a binary political system. You've got Republicans versus Democrats. There are no third party that really makes anything. It works best when you've got Conservatives in England versus Labour in England. But now the Social Democrats emerged and a few other political parties. The moment you get more than two dominant parties, the first past the post system becomes an unfair political system, like I explained about what happened in South Africa. The moment you have more political parties, the proportional representation system is the far better system to use, because now you can reflect far more equitable the support for each and every political party that there is. But proportional systems tend to be very productive. You get a lot of kids in this family. So you see the emergence of hundreds of political parties, because every political party can have a say, and Holland is very often used to show how 14 or 18 political parties sit in a small parliament and decision making is very difficult. That caused, of course, a system of coalition governments that is almost a given in a proportional system and not in a first past the post system. But Great Britain, somebody that we will watch in March this year is Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau resigned as Prime Minister of Canada because he started with the electoral reform in Canada and couldn't get it through. He wanted to move away from first past the post to proportional, but he couldn't get that past the Canadian Parliament. So to change from one system to another is a very, very difficult system. And South Africa is one of the success stories of moving away from a system through a process of political reform in general that included electoral reform. Now, in proportional representation, I mentioned to you that there are several forms. The one version that is very dominant and that I like is a proportional system where you have a margin in terms of percentages. In other words, everybody can participate in the election, but unless you get 2 or 3 or even 5% of the vote, you're not going to parliament. That limits the number of political parties that go to parliament. There's a lot of arguments against it, but I think if you look at the South African system where you have 3 or 4, maybe 5 political parties with significant numbers, and the other 9 are fractions of percentages, but they've got voices as hard and as dominant as all the others. And at local government, that is currently destructive. The number of small parties with the ability to bring down governments in terms of motions of no confidence and all kinds of things. Then there's a hybrid system that we see in Germany, where elections take place nationally, which we will see in February when the German federal elections take place. But there's also state elections where proportional representation takes place at the state level, with an outcome within a specific lender, as the name the Germans use for a state or a province. And South Africa is a very good example. We have local government elections where half of a council is elected proportionally, reflective of everybody in that community. The other half represents wards in that community, where you can actually pinpoint who is my representative in my local municipality. And that presents a very balanced system at local government level. And I think this is something, if we are looking at electoral reform in South Africa, I think we should look more closely to a model that we have designed ourselves and that we've tested over the last 30 years, and it is working fairly well. The only change that we also made provision in our electoral system for individuals to take place outside of political parties. Well, the experience in the last election was very disappointing. I was of the opinion that 2 or 3 people with really big national footprints would be able to garner enough support to sit in parliament on their own without a political party, but that wasn't possible. So the Constitutional Court's ruling that individuals can also participate in proportional representation that is really designed for political parties was not a successful enterprise.
Prof, I just wanted to make sure I understand you correctly. You mentioned the hybrid system used in our local government elections, where half of the seats in the municipal council is allocated based on PR. The other half is allocated based on wards. Your only concern with that at local government level is that there is no what's colloquially known as a threshold. So there's no threshold that needs to be passed for the PR seats.
Yes, that is exactly my position. The threshold is a very important principle we should investigate further in South Africa, because if you look at the outcome of our election recently and you look at the numbers that political parties got in that election, I can think of several political parties that really got in the 0.25 percentage points, sometimes even lower, as low as 0.20% of the vote. Now, to give it numbers, for a seat in parliament in our national election, you needed between 45 and 50,000 votes. That constitute about 1% of the vote. In this election, with lower number of people participating, that number actually came down. So if you have 0.2% of the vote, that means you've got a fifth of 42,000 votes. That's 15,000 to 20,000 votes will get you in parliament. Why is that possible? Well, we use the proportional system with a single transferable vote. That means you work out the votes, and then there are, of course, fractions. If a political party gets, let's say, 50.8% of the vote, that 0.8% can be rounded off to 51%, but the system doesn't work that way. The system then takes that fraction and it gives it to a political party that, let's say, had 13.9% of the vote. So they take that fraction and they add it to this party with the highest remainder, and that party then gets a full number. And then they go down the list. So sometimes this transferable vote assists small parties in getting in. But if you have a benchmark of, say, 2% or 3%, that changes the whole thing. And I think that is the one area where South Africa, and in our electoral reform, which is currently finding their feet. I know electoral reform processes go slow, and previously we had a wonderful exercise done by Dr. Frederik van Zyl-Slabbert. I think that was a very thorough exercise. It was done well. They made some very valuable recommendations, but it was Thabo Mbeki as president. The ANC had 65% of the vote. If you have that number of votes, and if you have got that control over the political system, you're not going to change anything. But with 40% of the vote, the playground has changed for electoral reform. And I think if we can get beyond the issues that we had over the last month or two, where certain legislation is signed and approved and implemented without communicating in the government of national unity, I think they will get over this problem. It's a teething problem. I think then electoral reform does have a much better chance of getting attention in a government of national unity than what it ever had the chance of getting attention where a political party was in total control.
For the average South African who has now listened to you talk about first past the post as an example of simple majoritarian, listen to you talk about PR systems, listen to you talk about hybrid systems, which one does South Africa use and how does it work and what are the problems with it?
Okay, we made a transition from first past the post to proportional representation in 1994. And political parties had a hard time changing the culture. You see, when you have a specific system, a culture develops. Let's defined culture as a way of doing things. The system in South Africa, they had to explain to the typical guy on the ground that you wouldn't know your representative because we work with a list system. PR with a list system. That means each political party presents a list to the IEC. Some political parties use a national list and a provincial list. Some political parties, like the DA, only use a provincial list. But whatever way they've decided to do it, there's a list. And if somebody on your list resigns out of the political party, you just move another person up on the list. Previously, with the first past the post, if somebody resigned from parliament, you had to have a by-election. That's why we have by-elections in local government, because we've got a ward system. So by-elections is a given when you have first past the post. In proportional representation, it's not necessary because you've got a list system. But here comes the problem. If I've got a problem where I live and I want to talk to my representative in parliament, I can't tell you who it is. And that is one of the political reform elements that I think should be taken into account in electoral reform, to bring the member of parliament closer to a region or to a town or a city or an area, or let's call it a ward in some way. And some PR systems has done that, like in Germany, where you can say, those 10 guys, they represent my lender, my province, or those 5 guys are from here. And that is something that we have to look at, to bring parliament and the actions in parliament closer to people on the ground, because this is one of the key elements or the negative elements of PR, and that is people feel that the democracy is moving away from them. It is up there somewhere, but with first past the post, you have a direct say in that ward and that election. That's one of the positives of first past the post, and a negative of PR, that distance. And if you can close that distance, then you're cooking with gas.
And one of the points you mentioned was the gap between the actual representative and the voters. And that's a flaw that I also witnessed in the system, is because we vote for a political party and not the representative. And therefore, it does create issues of accountability in terms of, does the representative feel less pressured to serve the voters, as well as a disconnect with their representatives?
I think you picked it up very, very accurately, and especially in areas where we're sitting with emerging democracy, where democracy isn't yet part of the day-to-day business, and people are picking up what's going on in a democracy, how it works, and so on and so on. You would like to have politicians closer to the ground. And I hope this is something that this commission investigating electoral reform will absolutely take to heart, that there's some way of closing that gap. And I think you picked it up very, very accurately.
Hello, Prof. Thank you so much for the notes you've made so far. My question concerns how to level the political playing field for the independent candidates after they've been at a disadvantage for so long. This question has been in the discourse, but I think with the electoral amendment last year, it's come back to the forefront, and people are noticing that independent candidates have not been able to compete as political parties. So I was just wondering, practically, how can they be given a leg up in this playing field?
I'm also concerned about that issue, very much concerned. If you look at the Constitutional Court's ruling, it just ruled that the IEC must work out a way to accommodate independence. At that point, when that ruling was made, the ruling party, the ANC, was in a very dominant position. So the IEC then took the Constitutional Court's ruling and they said, okay, what we're going to do, we are going to make it, in my view, virtually impossible for an independent candidate to stand effectively. Because firstly, the number of votes they needed just to register was outrageously large. If you ask somebody to develop a list of people, a voting list with signatures of 18 or 20,000 or 15,000, it's unheard of. Why do you need those signatures? If somebody wants to register, let them register and let them get, let's say, 1,000 votes. That's reasonable. But the number of votes was unreasonable. Secondly, the way in which independent candidates had to compete, they could only compete for 200 out of the 400 representatives in Parliament. In other words, they were only given permission in terms of the IEC rules and regulations to compete in those elections that took place in provinces. Let me give you one example. I thought Zaki Ahmad, a person with a national profile on HIV, on human rights and all these things, I thought Zaki Ahmad is a shoe-in. He's a national figure, and he should have nationally enough votes to get into Parliament as a representative, because we need people like that in Parliament. Zaki Ahmad didn't even make it in the Western Cape, which tells me that the system to represent individual candidates is wrong and it needs adaptation.
Yeah, I think mine really focus on three very, very fundamental building blocks that underpin our electoral system. And the first one here talks about accountability. The second one talks about responsiveness. Third one talks about transparency. Now, these are values that are embedded in our national constitution. And somehow there's a disjuncture between the current electoral system and these three fundamental values. On the basis of this, one can really look very critically at our current system. Where's the accountability? Where's the responsiveness? Where's the transparency? And because they are not directly held accountable or for any of these, three fundamental values, it has become a political exercise that has no real benefit for ordinary people out there. We spent in the region of 2.3 billion rand on elections. And I've just done a bit of a research. It says here in the 2023-24 financial year, the Electoral Commission was given the amount of 2.3 billion. 900, almost a billion, goes for administration. 1.2 million goes for electoral operations. 236 million for outreach and 25 million, for additional work that they need to do. Now, you ask yourself, how is it possible that we spend such a lot of money, we need to make provision for it, but our entire electoral system fails, in terms of those three fundamental building blocks. And for me, then, the bigger question is, and I've listened very carefully to what Theo said, is what, and I know it's maybe remains a pipe dream, but what system will help us to ensure that our public representatives and our political parties, really honor those three fundamental values as it is currently embedded in our national constitution.
Thank you, Christo. Like always, you ask challenging questions, and I'll try and answer it as briefly as I can. I just want to mention something which is interesting knowledge for those of you interested in the economics and the political situation, while Christo mentioned the budget of the IEC. Keep a close eye on the statistics on employment over the last 3 or 4 years. And you will see every time in the quarter after an election, there's a huge rise in employment. That employment is a direct link to the amount of people that the IEC appoints in the 3 or 4 months before an election and during the election. Remember, they have to manage 28,000 voting districts. Every voting district at least has got 3 or 4, sometimes 10 people that got trained and that can do the job. So they do add, Christo, at least to temporary employment from time to time. So there's a little political benefit. The same thing happens in the United States before a presidential election. I think the TV stations are swimming in the dollars about the amount of money spent by politicians before an election. But back to your basic question. And I think your pipe dream is a harsh consideration, but not inaccurate. To move from first past the post to PR is a trade-off. And the trade-off we made is a trade-off between keeping somebody responsible, keeping somebody linked to a ward or a community versus having a fairer type of electoral system. And we went for the fairer type of a more equitable distribution of votes and political parties. So the price we pay for a system that is more reflective of what the voter wants is exactly the issues that you mentioned. If you have a system where there is a direct link and where you know where this guy is coming from and which ward and so on, it's far easier to keep tabs on people. That's why you saw somebody like Justin Trudeau going on the media and he said, it is impossible for me to continue my work. And there is direct pressure on him because the system, the first past the post, is far more direct. It's far more immediate. With proportional representation, there's almost a cushion because you've got a list between the people and the party. And the parties kind of move away, like I said earlier on, a gap emerge. And I hope in the research of our electoral reform that they will interrogate this very seriously.
Prof, I feel like I've learned so much in this podcast session with you. You have said that South Africa should look at the option of a hybrid system, the way it is employed in Germany. You've also mentioned the need for thresholds in hybrid systems. We have a hybrid system in our local government elections, and you mentioned a 2 to 3% threshold there, create greater stability in local government elections. What would your response be to the submission that affects the fairness? Because if Sonia and I, for example, vote for Christo, but Christo gets below the 2% threshold, then we're essentially not represented in our local government. And what effect would all of this have on local government elections? Please explain it to us practically.
Thank you for that. I answered Christo in terms of trade-offs. If you go from first past the post to PR, there's a trade-off. You lose direct representation, you lose this direct link, but you get greater equity. Now, if you do the same thing with a certain margin of saying, okay, you've got a threshold of 2 to 3%. The first thing that's going to happen, you are now going to influence the political dynamics. Just sit back for a moment and think about what happened last week. Action SA mentioned that they're now forming a coalition or a grouping or a whatever with the Forum for Service Delivery. Now, the Forum for Service Delivery emerged in the Northwest during local government elections, then eventually moved up and participated in national elections. So what Action SA did, they now formed a unity with the Forum for Service Delivery. Forum for Service Delivery wouldn't get anywhere, but they do have a following. Action SA clearly indicated to us that they have a strong following in local government elections, but not in national elections. And that formation was forced by the reality of the political situation. And I think if a threshold is introduced, you will immediately see how politicians are now looking for partners. So you're actually limiting the number of political parties, and you're actually forcing political parties. If you have this bottom line of 1 or 2%, you will see a natural coalescing of political parties. And it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off between 14 to 18 parties in the national parliament or 10 parties in a metro government that creates chaos all the time versus good governance. And I think that is where the trade-off sits. Is it good governance or is it equity despite all of the chaos?
That's very nicely said as an answer with regards to whether or not thresholds wouldn't limit the fairness, is that we need the thresholds for good governance sake.
Absolutely.
Venter, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Constitution at Work podcast. We are greatly appreciative. To our listeners and viewers, if you like this podcast, please remember to click like and subscribe. Until next time.